So Louis Petitjean says this economic resilience sounds a lot like the resilience one talks about with biodiversity. Decentralized organization and many independent actors let you bounce back. Is that fair?
Yes, it's a very good point. So actually in the book, if you think about diversity versus homogeneity, and if you think about the social contract, you can bounce back more easily if you have a social contract where one of us suffers a shock and the other one does not, and we help each other. So it's like a social insurance contract. But difference to insurance is that rather than just giving you money, I help you to bounce back by reskilling you. So rather than giving you unemployment money, I give you this reskilling tool. So I send you back to school or do something and in order to find a new job in a new industry and some things like that. So now coming back to, if you have a very diverse society, if there's a shock coming from outside, it will hit us differently. If you have a very homogeneous society, if there's a shock coming from outside, it all hits us the same way. So we cannot really insure each other if you're very homogeneous. And that's a challenge. So all the shocks are less, in econ language, less idiosyncratic. They're much more systematic shocks. And then we can't insure each other. If you're a diverse society, the shocks are more idiosyncratic, so we can insure each other. So on the one hand, we would like to have diversity or biodiversity in order to make a society more resilient. But we also, on the other hand, we know from the work, and that's where the biodiversity analogy fails, the work for Alberto Alesina and others, that the willingness of the people to insure each other and help each other in times of crisis is much less if there's a huge diverse society. If there's a more homogeneous society, actually the people are much more willing to help each other. So the ability to help each other is much bigger in a very diverse society, but the willingness is much bigger in a homogeneous society. And that's where the tension comes in. So you want to have an optimal mix, essentially. You want to have a diverse, open-minded society in order to be able to help each other because the shocks are hitting each other differently. But you also want to have enough homogeneity in order to make sure that people think they're part of the same group and they want to help each other. And that's what the tension is.
So this, I can actually make a nice bridge to the next question by the Brandon, or maybe it's a comment, who says, I understand of democratics being more resilient, but living in Brazil, a democratic with a big economy, but being in a negative feedback for a decade, my heart can't believe in this. So this relates very much to what you were saying, right? Like Brazil is famously a very heterogeneous society in the sense that there's lots of different types of people in Brazil from different types of backgrounds. It's a democracy, but not the first society that comes to mind when we think about resilience.
Yes, so I very much agree with that too.
Hey, this makes me wonder, so maybe we can relate this to one of my favorite books, which is by Darren Acemoglu and Professor Robinson. It's called The Narrow Corridor. And they go into what makes a society, they don't call it resilience, but they attach importance to inequality, and then especially the elite versus sort of the people kind of dynamic. And that's how they explain sort of the Weimar debacle or collapse, where they said, this was of course a democracy in name, but it was still a very dysfunctional society that is dominated by a small elite. No, it wasn't not necessarily obviously a dictatorship, but very similar to it because they had so much power. What do you think of that? And I think that could also be related to Brazil and in lesser extent now to the US, right?
Yeah, so it was dominated by the elites. Of course, it was in the transition phase. So you moved out from a very much a monarchy and into a democracy. So it was of course always a learning period. But I think what was the biggest threat for the Weimar Republic was essentially that this was a very multipolar society, and essentially each group had its own. I wouldn't call them police, but its own enforcers, and they were fighting street fights and even with weapons. And if you have the communists on the one side and the Nazis on the other side, and everybody's trying to enforce their way of thinking with weapons, that it's very hard to establish a democracy. And there was no common ground they could find together and make a coherent argument with each other, and that because it was just too polarized. Of course, the elite played an important role too, but even the non-elite was very, very divided. So both of it actually made it much more difficult. I'm not much of an expert of Brazil to say, okay, I don't think Brazil is in that stage, but I'm not an expert to judge about the society in Brazil. The other thing is, of course, inequality. That's the second part of your question, I would say. Inequality is contributing to that, but it depends very much what inequality is used for. So if you think inequality, there are some wealthy people just using their wealth and splurging it away, or they're actually investing in something productive. Now, if there is no inequality, we probably have way less investment in R&D and new technologies. And so if you have some wealthy people really pushing the frontier in investment and our knowledge, I think that's a good thing to have, as if we wouldn't have these investments otherwise. So, for example, Elon Musk is innovating new electric cars. I think that's what brought us forward, probably brought us forward 10 years ahead compared to not having electric cars. We might still drive mostly diesel cars otherwise.
I think that's an interesting example that you mentioned, because I've been thinking a little bit about it myself as well, because sort of inequality, equality, it's something where typically sort of the consensus position is, okay, you don't want too much inequality, but a little bit of inequality is good because it keeps people motivated. But this aspect, I've also been wondering about it because we often as Europeans maybe ask ourselves, why is there less innovation typically on the European continent than in, for example, the United States. And it might actually be that some of these billionaires, although I think a lot of them make very silly investments, a couple of them at least also do make very daring investments. That's what you were referring to, right?
Exactly. So, the question is, why did some Elon Musk move to the US and not to Europe?
Yeah.
The societies are different structured. So who is more inviting to invite these type of entrepreneurs to push the frontier, essentially, in technology?